We're going to continue our exploration of John's Gospel as we look at John chapter 11. And the first 45 verses or 44 verses of John chapter 11 really are all one story, but it's too much for us to deal with because it deals with two very important aspects within John's Gospel. In the first part, which is the one we're going to be doing today, which is in verses 1 to 20, we're going to be looking at what we call the 7 signs. Remember we said earlier that John loves that number 7. For him, the number 7 symbolizes the completed work of God. And so you've got the 7 I am sayings, which in fact we'll see in the second part of this story of the raising of Lazarus. But in this first part, in the first 20 verses, what we're going to be looking at is this next 7 stories that actually make up, in a sense, a connection with what John's trying to tell us. And we're going to look at them a little bit more closely in this particular session. So the story we're looking at is, of course, the raising of Lazarus. It's a story that's known well. It's a story that's often been talked about and connected, and the understanding of Lazarus coming forward. There's even songs, and I know Sunday school songs that were made about this particular story. But I think it's a story that's filled with importance for us to understand what John was trying to tell us, and also what we can also begin to learn and develop in terms of the concepts of discipleship. So let's listen again to the story as it comes to us from John chapter 11 and then verses 1 to 20. Now a man named Lazarus was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay ill, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is ill." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This illness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." "But Rabbi," they said, "a short while ago the Jews had tried to stone you, and yet you're going back?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks by night that they stumble, for they have no light." After he said this, he went on to tell them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up." His disciples replied, "Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better." Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. We're going to look more closely at that part of the story, just these 20 verses. Next week, what we'll do is we'll look at the rest of the story and the actual raising of Lazarus, and also, of course, another I am saying that will come out from that section. But today what we want to do is to focus on this section. And it's got some really interesting parts in it. It's got some strange bits as well. And what I'd love you to do now is to just discuss amongst each other what impressed you, what connected with you for the passage, what's interesting to you from the passage, what do you get out of the passage, what's your reflection on it. Welcome back. What we're going to be doing now is looking at one of the other structures within the Gospel of John. And this structure is connected to what John calls signs. Now, we would call them miracles or healings, but essentially they are signs to John's gospel. John only has a small number of healings. If you compare it to Mark's gospel, that Mark has many more of the healings, the exorcisms, the miraculous activities that Jesus did. John only really has a small number. And depending on how you define them, he really only has 7. Now, I'm going to be following another theologian by the name of Tom Wright. I'm going to follow his framework for the 7 because I think he is right about them. So what are the 7 signs that we see within John's gospel? Well, number 1 is we've got the marriage of Cana in Galilee, where Jesus changes the water to wine. And it seems like such an innocuous thing to do, but it is such an important passage because it talks about generosity. It talks about the abundance that Christ will produce in that situation. The second one is called the healing of the royal official's son, where an official comes to Jesus and says, "My son's dying, please come so that he can be healed." And Jesus sends him away saying, "Go, your son has been healed." And of course, he gets back there and the son is healed. And again, so the restoring of family relationship and the connections with that. Number 3 is the paralytic at the pool, who then Jesus comes across and he says, "Look, just put me in the pool when the water is agitated." And Jesus says, "Get up and walk." And he heals him. So in fact, gives far more than what the person expects. Number 4 is the feeding of the 5,000. This is one of the few miracles that are in all 4 of the Gospels. And so that's why it's such an important one. But there's no doubt at all that in John's Gospel, John uses the feeding of the 5,000 very much to talk about Jesus as the one who feeds us, who nourishes us, who gives us that which we need. Essentially, he talks then later about being the bread of life, and that comes out of that feeding. Sometimes people put a 5th healing, or the 5th miracle, or the 5th sign, as walking on water. I agree with Tom Wright that maybe that's not one of the signs, that in fact that's actually just more about Jesus and about his relationship with the disciples. In fact, number 5 is the healing of the man born blind. This is where a man's healed. He doesn't even know who's done it, but he gets into trouble for it. And so in the end, Jesus comes to him and says, "Now, you need to do this. Otherwise, in fact, things might go even worse for you." And this is the concept of blindness. And of course, blindness is often used as a symbol of not connecting with God. And so Jesus heals his blindness and then tells him that he needs to follow in the way of God, again, giving him a newness of life. And number 6 is, of course, the story that we're now dealing with in this passage. And that is the story of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Now, that's an obvious one, where Jesus then does the miraculous by bringing forth life in the midst of that situation. And I think that that's the key word, is the word life. When you look at all 7 of the signs, and I know that I've left number 7 out, but I'll come to that just now, is that when we look at those 6 first signs, all of them actually are about the ways in which God brings us or extends us or connects us to an abundant life. Remember in John chapter 10 that that's what God's promised us. He said that the good news was that we would have life, and life in all its fullness. I think that, in fact, the reason for the 7 signs is very much that what Jesus has come to do is to bring us life, and life in all its fullness. You know, I think that in many ways, for us to talk about people doing discipleship or becoming disciples, it's very hard for us to be disciples when we don't have the energy, we don't have the energizing or inspirational connection within us in order to actually make that happen. But if we look at each of the 6 signs so far, we see that what Jesus has come to do is to take away our blindness, is to take away our sense of being of death, or in fact even the fear of death, to take away the brokenness in terms of relationship in family, to actually give us more than what we expect. to give us generously, if we look at the story of the marriage of Cana in Galilee. And then, of course, to feed us on himself, to feed us in his life, in the feeding of the 5,000. And so can you see how each of those signs are really connected to that concept of life and life abundantly, which is very much part of what John is wanting to do. Remember that John's two major foci is the one side to say we need to grow in discipleship, and the other one is to say that the reason why and the way in which we're able to is because Jesus gives us life, a life that has meaning and purpose, a life that has energy and vitality, a life that can do that which we need to do. And that brings us to the seventh sign, which of course we'll get to at the end of the gospel, because it's in John's gospel that in Jesus on the cross says, it is finished. It is finished, just before he dies. And that last sign is the sign of the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's the sign in John, which then wraps up the seven, which then says that it was because of his death and resurrection on the cross that we can have life, and life in all its fullness. What I'd like you to do is to share together what that means for you, for us to have life, for us to live that life, to realize that in fact sometimes the sense of tiredness, depression, the sense of anxiety and worry that we have is often what drains us of our life. What does it mean for you that in fact it's in Christ that we can have our sense of life and life abundantly? Welcome back. We're now going to dive into a couple of different things. The one side, we're going to be looking at some of the symbols and explain some of those symbols a bit more carefully. And then the other one I want to do is to look at some of the things that don't quite make sense within the story. So let's start with some of the symbols. The first one is the name Lazarus. Lazarus is, of course, the name of this friend who's got sisters of Mary and Martha. Potentially they were living together in a house in Bethany, which is just a couple of kilometers away from Jerusalem. And the interesting thing here is what Lazarus means. The word Lazarus, or the name Lazarus, means God is my help. God is my help. And isn't that an appropriate name for this story? Of course, we don't hear about Lazarus in the other Gospels, except in Luke's Gospel, where he's used as an illustration, or where at least the name is used as an illustration. And that's a relationship between the rich man and the beggar, Lazarus. But in this case, God is my help. I think that there's no doubt at all that that name is not it's not by accident. It's not a coincidence that the person that Jesus comes to raise from the dead is in fact the person called God is my help. There's no doubt that God was his help in Christ coming to him and reanimating his life in this process. So can you see that there's a symbol happening here? There's something happening in the story, because notice as well that the strange thing, and one of the strange things is, of course, Jesus hears that Lazarus is ill, and then he decides to stay where he is for another 2 days. I love the way that's written. It kind of says that he cared for him so much that he then stayed where he was for 2 days. But notice when he explains to his disciples what's going to happen, he says, I've done this so that you may believe. We can see, therefore, that this story is a symbolic story. It's a story that's supposed to teach a lesson. It's what they used to call in the old days an object lesson. So it's an object lesson of faith, of acknowledging that, in fact, God has a plan, that God has a purpose for them. The other thing that's also strange in the passage is this concept where it tells us, and in the NIV it's put in brackets, that in fact this is the Mary, and when it's explaining that in fact Lazarus was Mary and Martha's brother, it says this is the Mary who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. Now, if you're saying, yes, I know that story, you know that story not because you've read it so far in John's Gospel, because in fact that story only comes in chapter 12. Now, I find that fascinating, that here in chapter 11, it's referring to something that we actually haven't read yet. Now, why would that be? why would John write something in chapter 11 that actually he's not going to talk about, or is that he's not going to actually tell you the story of until chapter 12? Now, we don't know. There's no simple way to answer that question, other than what it's trying to do is to give us a framework in which to understand this story, that this story goes together with a previous story, of course, of Mary and Martha, and then the latter story that's going to be in chapter 12. But I think that it's interesting that, in a sense, John's expecting his readers to know the whole story. And therefore, when they come back and read this verse, they'll go, I know what's going to happen. I know that that's actually something that's going to happen in the future. But it's interesting that at this point where it says, this is the Mary who poured the perfume on Jesus, that in fact, she hasn't done it yet in the chronology of the story. It tells you that John is less worried about chronology and he's much more worried about narrative or story. And that each story is of itself, rather than seeing to be part of a chronology, a sense of that each thing happens after the next. It's not that things are happening after the next. He's writing his story so that each story stands for something, that it actually is part of a whole in terms of teaching and understanding. The next thing that we need to see from this one is a couple of other contextual things. The one is, it tells us here that Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. Now, that's an interesting little aside, but it's not just something that's just thrown in. The number 4 is significant here, because in Jewish culture, what they believed was that the spirit would hover around the body for 3 days. So for 3 days, the spirit would still be around the dead body. But after the 4th day, the spirit would leave and go to Sheol. And that meant that at that point, there was no possibility for reanimation. There was no possibility for coming alive again. And I think that's why this story wants to tell us that what Jesus is going to do even the impossible in raising the dead. Now, remember that Jesus wasn't the only one going around doing some of these miracles. There were others as well. But there were the socio environment that he was living in said that after 4 days, reanimation wasn't possible. That concept of impossibility is very important in terms of understanding what John's wanting to teach us about what Jesus does. Jesus doesn't just come and restart things. Jesus changes them. So I'd like you to think about that for a while. Think about what are some of those stories, the concept of Lazarus's name, the fact that Jesus can do the impossible. What does that mean for you? Welcome back. I want to close off this time together with just looking at some of the characters who also are part of this story. And the 2 characters, well, in fact, there's, I suppose, 3 characters involved, is the character of Thomas, and then the character of Martha and Mary. And I'm doing Martha and Mary together because they really form one whole. What we need to realize, first of all, is Thomas. I love Thomas Didymus. Because, of course, it's Thomas who's the one who, remember, that says, unless, this is after the resurrection, that unless I can put my fingers in his hands and my hand in his side, I will not believe. Often he's called Thomas the doubter. But I love Thomas, because Thomas is that guy that goes, oh, well, whatever will be, will be. And in this particular story, he says, well, let's go with him, because then we can go and die with him. He's such an interesting character in terms of saying, well, come on, let's make it happen. If he's going to go, then we're going to go as well. In fact, Thomas is one of those people who just says whatever he thinks. And I love that image, or that concept of Thomas within the story, because this story, it makes it real. It makes the characters real. That Jesus actually saying, I'm going to go back to Jerusalem where they almost stoned me. And Thomas says, well, then we'll go with you. And if we're going to get stoned, well, then so be it. There's a sense almost of resignation of what God actually has planned. The other ones is a bit different in terms of Mary and Martha. Because in Mary and Martha, what we see is that, remember, the first time we see Mary and Martha in John's Gospel is, in fact, when Jesus comes to visit. And Mary comes and sits at Jesus' feet and listens to him and is devoted to him. And Martha's the one who's in the kitchen, kind of looking after things. And in the end, she comes out and says, come on, tell Mary to come and help me. And Jesus essentially says, come on, I'm not going to be with you always. Mary is actually doing that which she needs to do. She's devoted to me. But I find it so funny that in this story, things have changed. Because, of course, Lazarus has died. And now it's Martha who comes to Jesus. And in a very cryptic way, it says Mary stayed at home. I find that fascinating, that the change in Mary between those two stories. On the one, when everything was going okay, when life was going well, she was sitting at the feet of Jesus and being devoted to him. But now things have gone wrong. Her brother has died. And she feels to some degree that Jesus was responsible, that if he had come earlier, it wouldn't have happened, as we'll see later on in next week's session. And so she then, in a sense, she says, no, I'm not going to go and see him. I wonder how many times that might be our response as well. Is that when things are going well, that when things are going the way we're expecting it to, the way in which we want them to, that our devotion to God and to Jesus is strong, and we sit at his feet. But as soon as things don't go so well, when things aren't going as well as we like, we find out that, well, then we don't want to be part of relationship with him. In the application of this story today, what I'd like us to think about is about when life is not abundant, when life is not going the way we want it to go. How do we deal with that? Do we deal with it as Martha or as Mary? Or in fact, do we deal with it as Thomas, where we say, whatever will be, I will keep going with God? I pray that in fact we may have a look at this and see and discuss it a little bit about the different ways in which they respond to the concept of the life that isn't abundant.